The moment my stepmother told me my twin daughters weren't real family, I realized I had spent years begging for a place at a table that was never meant for us. Looking back now, I wish I had walked away much sooner. It would have saved my girls from a question no child should ever have to ask. But at the time, I still believed love, patience, and loyalty could fix almost anything. I was wrong. My name is Hannah Brooks. I'm 28 years old, a certified financial planner, and the mother of two incredible 5-year-old twin girls, Lily and Sophie. They are the reason I get up every morning. The reason I kept trying to hold my family together long after it became obvious I was the only one making the effort. The whole story started 3 days before what was supposed to be our first family vacation in years. The girls had been counting down to it for almost 2 months. Every night before bed, they crossed another square off the little paper calendar hanging on our refrigerator. Lily couldn't stop talking about roasting marshmallows by the lake, while Sophie had already packed 3 different swimsuits because she couldn't decide which one Grandpa would like best. Their excitement filled our little house with so much happiness that even after long days at work, I couldn't help smiling every time I heard them planning imaginary adventures together. That Thursday morning felt completely normal. I was making blueberry pancakes while the girls argued over which stuffed animal deserved to come on vacation. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I smiled when I saw my father's name. I assumed he was sending another reminder about what time everyone planned to leave on Saturday. Instead, I opened a message that made my stomach tighten. "Can you come over tonight? We need to discuss something about the trip." It wasn't long, it wasn't emotional, but something about it felt cold. My father usually called. He never texted important conversations. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before another message appeared. "Come alone." I looked toward the living room where Lily and Sophie were trying to fit beach towels into backpacks that were obviously too small. Sophie looked up with the biggest smile. "Mom, Grandpa's going to teach me how to fish first because I'm older by 4 minutes." Lily immediately crossed her arms. "That's not fair." I laughed even though something inside me suddenly didn't feel right. "We'll figure it out," I told them. "You two finish packing while I clean up breakfast." Neither of them noticed how distracted I had become. They were too busy imagining the perfect vacation. Seeing them so happy made me think about everything that had happened since my father remarried. My mother died when I was 16. Losing her changed everything. Dad buried himself in work, and for years it was just the two of us. Then he met Vivian. At first, I was genuinely happy for him. She was organized, confident, elegant, and seemed to bring light back into his life. She had a son named Ethan from her first marriage. He was 5 years younger than me, charming when he wanted something, and somehow always managed to become the center of every conversation. During those first months, I told myself blending families simply took time. I ignored little things because I wanted my father to be happy. Vivian never openly insulted me. She was far too clever for that. Instead, she mastered tiny exclusions that sounded harmless if anyone questioned them. At Christmas, Ethan always opened the first gift while everyone watched. During birthdays, she made sure his favorite meals were served, even if someone else's birthday was being celebrated. Family photos somehow ended with me standing on the edge instead of beside Dad. After Lily and Sophie were born, things became even more obvious. Vivian always bought Ethan expensive birthday presents while handing my daughters matching coloring books and saying, "They're still too little to know the difference." She remembered Ethan's favorite dessert, but forgot the girls' birthdays twice. At family dinners, she spoke proudly about Ethan's future in the family business but rarely asked how my work was going. Whenever I noticed these things, Dad always had an explanation. "She doesn't mean anything by it. You're reading too much into it. Give her more time." So I did, for years, because I loved my father and because I wanted my daughters to grow up knowing their grandfather. I convinced myself that eventually Vivian would see them as family too. Looking back now, I wasn't protecting peace. I was protecting everyone else's comfort while sacrificing my own. That evening I drove to Dad's house alone after asking my sweet neighbor Mrs. Jenkins to watch the girls for a couple of hours. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the SUV was already packed with suitcases, camping chairs, fishing gear, and coolers. They were clearly excited about leaving. The front door was open, and I could hear Ethan laughing inside. Vivian greeted me with the same polished smile she wore whenever she had already made up her mind about something. "Come in, Hannah," she said pleasantly. Dad stood in the kitchen pretending to organize travel documents. He barely looked at me. That was when I knew this conversation wasn't going to end well. Vivian folded her hands together. "We've made a small change regarding the vacation." I waited for her to continue. "The resort has limited space for some of the activities, so we decided to keep things simple." I frowned. "Simple how?" She smiled again. "Immediate family only." I looked at Dad, expecting him to clarify. He remained silent. "I don't understand," I said slowly. "Then's fiancé is coming." Vivian nodded. "Yes, of course." "So she's immediate family." "She's joining the family." I felt my heartbeat quicken. "And my daughters." Vivian's expression never changed. "They're your daughters, Hannah?" For a moment, I honestly thought she had misspoken. "They're also Dad's granddaughters." She sighed as though I were making something unnecessarily complicated. "They're not related to me by blood, and this trip is meant to celebrate our family's future. I think it's better if only real family comes." The room fell completely silent. I waited for my father to say something. Anything to tell her she'd gone too far. Instead, he quietly rubbed his forehead and whispered, "Let's not turn this into an argument." My chest tightened. Vivian looked almost relieved by his silence. "I'm sure the girls will understand." At that exact moment, I realized she had never intended to accept Lily and Sophie. They would always be outsiders. I slowly stood up from the chair, looked at my father one last time, and understood that the man who had once promised nothing would ever come before me had just chosen peace with his wife over protecting his own daughter and granddaughters. I walked toward the front door without another word, but before I reached it, Ethan came inside carrying shopping bags and grinned. "Good thing the kids aren't coming," he said casually. This trip would have been way too crowded. No one corrected him. No one defended my daughters. I drove home in complete silence, trying to think of a way to explain everything to two little girls who had spent weeks dreaming about making memories with the grandfather they adored. The moment I opened my front door, Lily and Sophie came running toward me holding the picture they had drawn that afternoon. 4 smiling stick figures stood beside a lake, and across the top, Lily had written in colorful crayon, "or family vacation." Sophie looked up at me with bright, hopeful eyes and asked, "Mom, what time are we leaving on Saturday?" Before I could answer, Lily noticed the tears filling my eyes and quietly asked the question that shattered whatever strength I still had left. "Mom, are we not part of the family anymore?" At that moment, I knew something inside me had changed forever. That night, after I finally got Lily and Sophie to sleep, I sat alone at my kitchen table staring at the family vacation drawing they had left behind. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I couldn't bear looking at it either. The smiling stick figures suddenly felt like strangers. I kept hearing Lily's question over and over in my head. "Mom, are we not part of the family anymore?" No 5-year-old should ever wonder whether she belongs. I blamed Vivian for saying those words, but what hurt even more was knowing my father had been standing right there and chosen silence. He had watched his granddaughters be pushed aside and decided that keeping peace with his wife mattered more than protecting 2 little girls who loved him unconditionally. Around 10 that night, my phone rang. Grace's name appeared on the screen. She had been my closest friend since college and the attorney I trusted whenever my financial planning practice needed legal advice. The moment I answered, she knew something was wrong. "You sound exhausted," she said softly. I laughed without humor. "I think my family finally made it clear where my girls and I belong." I told her everything, from Vivian's calm smile to Ethan's careless comment and my father's silence. Grace listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked only one question. "Hannah, why have you spent so many years protecting people who never protected you?" I didn't have an answer. Maybe because losing my mother so young made me terrified of losing the rest of my family too. Maybe because I wanted my daughters to know their grandfather. Maybe because I believed that if I just kept being patient, eventually things would change. Grace sighed. "Tomorrow morning, come by my office before work. I want to show you something." "About what?" I asked. "About everything you've done for them." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Just trust me." After we hung up, I barely slept. Every memory I had spent years making excuses for suddenly looked different. Vivian had never forgotten my daughter's birthdays by accident. She had chosen not to remember. Ethan hadn't become entitled overnight. Someone had taught him that the world would always make room for him, even if someone else had to step aside. Most painful of all, my father hadn't changed in one evening. He had simply revealed the choice he had been making for years. The next morning, I dropped Lily and Sophie off at kindergarten. They tried to act cheerful, but I noticed they weren't talking about the vacation anymore. Sophie usually waved until she disappeared inside the building. That morning, she hugged me a little longer before quietly asking, "Grandpa still loves us, right?" I kissed her forehead and forced myself to smile. "Nothing you girls did caused any of this." She nodded, but children are smarter than adults realize. They hear the words we don't say. I drove straight to Grace's office downtown. Thick folders already covered the conference table when I walked in. "What's all this?" I asked. Grace motioned for me to sit. "Your history." I laughed nervously. "I think you're being dramatic." She slid the first folder toward me. Am I? Inside were financial reports, contracts, restructuring plans, and years of correspondence that I barely remembered signing. After opening my own financial planning practice, I had gradually become the person my father called whenever the family business faced difficult decisions. It had never seemed unusual. He'd ask for advice on refinancing equipment, negotiating loans, improving cash flow, or planning expansions. I never charged him. He was my father. Helping him felt natural. Grace pointed to one agreement. "Do you remember this?" I scanned the pages. "The refinancing package from 6 years ago." Keep reading. Halfway down the page, my name appeared several times. I wasn't just listed as an advisor. I had personally guaranteed part of the restructuring plan because my financial credentials and client portfolio had strengthened the company's application. I remember signing it. I admitted. Dad said the bank needed another professional opinion. Grace nodded. "That's what he told you." She opened another folder. "Here's the renewal." Then another. And another. I slowly realized a pattern. Every few years, whenever the company needed additional financing or better lending terms, my father had quietly asked for my professional support. Sometimes I reviewed financial forecasts. Sometimes I signed as an independent consultant. Sometimes I personally introduced them to lenders and investors who trusted my judgment after years of working together. None of it had ever seemed extraordinary, because I never viewed helping my father as a business transaction. It was family. Grace folded her arms. "Do you know how many hours you've invested in that company over the last 7 years?" I shrugged. "No." She turned her laptop toward me. A spreadsheet filled the screen. Conservative estimates placed my unpaid consulting work at well over 3,000 hours. If billed at my normal professional rate, it would have been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I stared silently at the number. I never kept track. I whispered. "Exactly," Grace replied. "You kept giving because you thought one day they'd appreciate it." I looked away. She wasn't wrong. Every late night phone call, every emergency meeting, every canceled weekend with my girls because Dad needed help preparing financial documents before Monday morning. I had always believed I was investing in my family's future. Grace opened one final folder. "There's something else?" She pointed to a clause I had completely forgotten existed. My continued involvement as an outside financial advisor had been referenced repeatedly in several banking relationships. My reputation wasn't the only reason lenders felt comfortable extending favorable terms, but it had become part of the picture over the years. "I'm not saying the company exists because of you," Grace said carefully. "It doesn't. Your father built that business long before you became involved. But you've become one of the reasons lenders trust it." I leaned back in my chair, stunned. Dad never mentioned any of this. Maybe he assumed you'd never stop helping. I thought about Vivian confidently telling me my daughters weren't real family. I thought about Ethan acting as though the company already belonged to him. Neither of them had the slightest idea how many invisible pieces held everything together. Grace closed the folders. "I'm not telling you to hurt anyone, Hannah." "Then why show me this now?" She looked directly into my eyes. "Because you need to understand something. Walking away from people who refuse to respect you isn't revenge. Sometimes it's simply refusing to carry responsibilities that were never meant to belong to you forever." Those words stayed with me long after I left her office. On the drive home, my father called. I let it ring until voicemail. A few seconds later, another call came, then another. Finally, he left a message. Hannah, your stepmother thinks things got a little emotional yesterday. Maybe we can all sit down after we get back from the trip and move past this? Move past this. As though my daughters had merely missed dessert instead of being told they weren't family. As though children's hearts could simply be rescheduled. I deleted the voicemail without replying, but before I could put my phone away, another message appeared. This one wasn't from my father, it was from Vivian. I hope you'll be mature enough not to make this vacation uncomfortable for everyone else. I read it twice before quietly locking my phone. For the first time in years, I wasn't wondering how to make everyone else comfortable. I was wondering what kind of future I wanted for Lily and Sophie if I kept teaching them that love had to be earned from people who had already decided they didn't belong. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and perfect weather, the kind of morning my girls had imagined for weeks. I woke up before sunrise and stood in the kitchen staring at the two tiny suitcases they had packed themselves. Lily had folded every shirt twice because she wanted Grandpa to think she was organized like Mommy. Sophie had secretly packed 3 stuffed animals even though I had told her she could only bring one. I couldn't bring myself to unpack them. Instead, I made pancakes just like I had promised, pretending it was an ordinary weekend. The girls tried to match my smile, but I could see they were waiting for me to say something about the trip. Finally, Lily looked up from her plate. Are we staying home? I reached across the table and held both of their little hands. Yes, sweetheart. Neither of them cried. That somehow hurt even more. Sophie simply lowered her head and quietly asked, did Grandma Vivian change her mind? I took a slow breath. She made a decision? Lily looked confused. But Grandpa wanted us there. I couldn't lie to them anymore. Grandpa didn't stop it. The room fell silent. Children don't always understand complicated family dynamics, but they understand disappointment. They understand who shows up and who doesn't. After breakfast, I loaded the girls into the car and drove to the neighborhood park instead of sitting at home thinking about what my family was doing. We spent 2 hours feeding ducks, pushing swings, and pretending everything was fine. Every few minutes, one of the girls would point toward the highway and ask if that was the road Grandpa was taking to the mountains. Each question felt like another small crack in my heart. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. Dad, I ignored it. A minute later, another call came. Then a text. Can you bring over the blue folder from my office? I forgot it, and we already left town. I stared at the message in disbelief. After everything that had happened, he still expected me to help without acknowledging what he had done. He hadn't asked how the girls were feeling. He hadn't apologized. He hadn't even mentioned them. He simply needed another favor. Before I could respond, another message appeared. This one came from Ethan. Dad says it's urgent. Thanks. No greeting. No apology. Just an expectation that I'd fix another problem. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my purse. For the first time in years, I chose not to rescue someone else's poor planning. When we got home that afternoon, Lily carried her untouched suitcase back to her bedroom. I watched through the doorway as she slowly unpacked every neatly folded shirt without saying a word. Sophie climbed onto her bed beside her sister and whispered, maybe next time. Lily shook her head. Grandma doesn't want us. Hearing those words come from a 5-year-old nearly broke me. I walked into the room and wrapped both girls in my arms. Listen to me, I said softly. There is absolutely nothing wrong with either of you. Sometimes adults make selfish decisions. That's never a child's fault. Sophie looked up with watery eyes. Then why don't they want us? I swallowed the lump in my throat. Because some people confuse love with control. They think family means only the people they choose. Lily leaned against me. Are we still a family? I kissed the top of her head. We are the best family I've ever known. That evening, Mrs. Jenkins knocked on our front door carrying a homemade peach cobbler. She had noticed the girls weren't on vacation and wanted to check on us. After hearing a gentle version of what happened, she simply shook her head. Your mother would have never allowed those babies to feel unwanted. Tears instantly filled my eyes. No one had mentioned my mom in months. Mrs. Jenkins smiled kindly. She always said family wasn't measured by blood. It was measured by who stayed when life became difficult. Those words lingered in my mind long after she left. Later that night, I walked into my home office intending to catch up on work. Instead, my eyes landed on a stack of binders labeled with the family business name. They contained years of financial projections, loan reviews, succession planning, tax strategies, and restructuring recommendations. Every binder represented weekends I'd sacrificed, vacations I'd shortened, and evenings I'd spent working after putting my daughters to bed. I pulled one file from the shelf and opened it. My handwriting covered the margins with notes reminding my father which financial decisions would strengthen the company over the next decade. Another binder contained an emergency cash flow plan I had built during a difficult year when several major clients delayed payments. I remembered staying awake until nearly 3 in the morning helping Dad prepare those reports because he had sounded so defeated on the phone. He had hugged me afterward and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you." Somewhere along the way, those words had disappeared, not because I had changed, but because Vivian slowly convinced everyone that my contributions were simply expected. I wasn't appreciated anymore. I was convenient. My phone buzzed once again. This time it was Grace. "How are the girls?" she asked. "Better than I am," I admitted. "Good," she replied. "Because tomorrow I'd like you to stop thinking like someone's daughter for just 1 hour." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "Come to my office again. Bring every document you have regarding the family business. I want you to see the entire picture, not just the pieces your father chose to show you." I looked across the room at the shelves full of files I hadn't touched in years. "Grace, are you telling me there's something I still don't know?" She was quiet for a moment before answering. "Hannah, I think you've spent so long believing you were helping your family that you never stopped to ask how much of that family's future was quietly resting on your shoulders." I slowly looked back at the binders lining my office wall, and for the first time, I realized they weren't just records of my father's business. They were evidence of every invisible promise I had kept while everyone else slowly forgot I had ever made them. The next morning, after dropping Lily and Sophie off at school, I loaded every binder, folder, and storage box I could find into the back of my SUV and drove to Grace's office. By the time I arrived, my shoulders ached from carrying years of paperwork I had never expected to look at again. Grace raised an eyebrow as I walked through the door balancing 2 heavy boxes. I wasn't kidding when I said bring everything. I managed a tired smile. Neither was I. She cleared the conference table while I stacked the files one by one. Looking at them all together was overwhelming. There were annual financial reports, succession planning documents, loan applications, tax strategies, business valuations, insurance reviews, investment proposals, and handwritten notes dating back almost 7 years. I had never realized how much of my own life was sitting inside those cardboard boxes. Grace poured 2 cups of coffee before opening the first binder. "Today we're not looking at this as your father's daughter," she said. "We're looking at it as professionals." I nodded, though part of me still struggled to separate the two. She opened the oldest restructuring file. "Let's start here." The company had nearly collapsed 6 years earlier after losing one of its largest commercial contracts. I remembered Dad calling me late one Friday night, his voice shaking with panic. He had told me he didn't know if he could make payroll the following month. I had spent the entire weekend helping him rebuild cash flow projections, negotiate payment schedules with suppliers, and prepare financial presentations for the bank. At the time, I had never considered charging him. He was my father. Families helped each other. Grace slid another document toward me. "Who created this recovery plan?" I looked down. My own signature appeared at the bottom. "I did?" This. Another signature. Mine again. We continued through file after file. Every major financial decision over the past several years carried my fingerprints somewhere. Some reports had been prepared entirely by me. Others included my recommendations in the margins. I had developed expansion models, retirement planning, risk assessments, lending strategies, and contingency plans. None of it had ever felt extraordinary because I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was simply trying to help my father keep the business alive. Grace finally stopped and leaned back in her chair. "Do you know what I see?" I shook my head. Someone who became the invisible foundation of a company without ever asking for recognition. I looked away uncomfortably. "Wasn't looking for recognition." "No," she replied gently. "You were looking for love." That sentence landed harder than anything Vivian had ever said, because it was true. Every late night, every canceled weekend, every emergency meeting had been my way of saying, "I'm still part of this family." Somewhere deep inside, I had believed that if I continued showing up whenever they needed me, eventually they would see my daughters and me as people worth choosing. Instead, they had accepted everything I gave while quietly convincing themselves I owed it to them. Grace opened another folder containing correspondence between the company and its primary lender. No, this is where things become interesting. She pointed to several letters. These banks didn't approve financing because you were family. I studied the documents carefully. She continued. They approved financing because an independent certified financial planner with an excellent professional reputation was willing to remain involved as an outside advisor during critical growth periods. I frowned. That doesn't mean they can't survive without me? No, Grace agreed. It doesn't. She paused before adding. But it does mean they'll have to prove they can. That distinction mattered. She wasn't telling me I controlled the company. She wasn't suggesting I had some secret legal ownership or hidden power. What she was showing me was something much simpler. Trust. For years, lenders, investors, and business partners had trusted the company partly because they trusted me. My reputation had quietly become one of its strongest assets. Grace highlighted several clauses in ongoing consulting agreements. You've been renewing these every year because your father asked you to. I nodded slowly. He always said it was just routine paperwork. Routine paperwork with legal consequences. She turned another page toward me. My consulting agreement renewed automatically every July unless either party provided formal written notice. We were only a few weeks away from renewal. What happens if I don't renew? I asked. Grace answered carefully. Nothing dramatic overnight. The business doesn't disappear. The company doesn't collapse. But lenders will request updated documentation. Existing financial relationships may need to be reviewed. Future expansion plans could slow down until everything is reevaluated. I sat quietly absorbing every word. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't even punishment. It was simply what happened when a professional relationship ended. Grace looked at me kindly. Hannah, you've been treating this like unconditional family support. Legally, it's a professional arrangement that you've continued providing for free. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had separated those two ideas. To me, they had always been the same. Family came first. Family helped. Family sacrificed. But maybe that had only been true for me. My phone vibrated across the table. Dad. I silenced the call. 30 seconds later, another one came. Then another. Grace didn't say anything. She simply waited. Eventually, a voicemail notification appeared. I pressed play. Hannah, Dad began, sounding distracted more than concerned. We're having a little issue with one of the activity reservations. Vivian said you handled some of the booking details. Give me a call when you get this? I stared at the phone in disbelief. Not once did he ask how Lily and Sophie were doing. Not once did he apologize. His first concern was a reservation. Grace quietly reached over and paused the recording before it finished. Do you notice something? She asked. I nodded. Still thinks I'll fix it. She smiled sadly. Because you've always fixed it. A few minutes later, another message arrived. This one came from Vivian. Your father is under enough stress. Please don't make this vacation about yourself. I read the sentence twice before locking my screen. For years, I had allowed those kinds of comments to fill me with guilt. I felt something completely different. Distance. Almost clarity. Grace gathered the documents into two neat piles. I'm not telling you to retaliate, she said firmly. I'm telling you to decide whether you want to keep carrying responsibilities for people who made it clear your daughters don't belong in their family. I looked down at the renewal documents resting in front of me. 7 years of unpaid work, thousands of hours, countless sacrifices. Every signature had been given willingly because I believed I was building something for all of us. Now I realized I had been building a future that no longer included my children. I slowly picked up the unsigned renewal form and slipped it back into its envelope. For the first time since leaving my father's house, I wasn't thinking about what Vivian had taken from my daughters. I was thinking about what I had the power to stop giving away. For the first time in years, I stopped asking myself how to save my family and started asking a much harder question. What did I owe the people who had just told my daughters they didn't belong? I carried that question with me all the way home. The house was quiet when I walked in, and for a few minutes, I simply stood in the living room listening to the sound of the clock on the wall. Everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt the same anymore. The framed family pictures I had once treasured suddenly seemed dishonest. Every smiling face reminded me how easy it had been for everyone to pretend we were one big family until the moment my girls actually needed to be included. I picked up the vacation drawing Lily had made and carefully placed it inside my desk drawer. I wasn't ready to throw it away, but I also couldn't bear seeing it every day. That evening, after the twins were asleep, I sat at my laptop and opened the consulting agreement Grace had emailed me. I read every page slowly, this time as a professional instead of a daughter. The language was simple. Either party could end the consulting relationship with written notice. There were no penalties, no lawsuits, no dramatic consequences. It simply meant I would no longer be responsible for advising the company or representing it during financial reviews. For 7 years, I had renewed the agreement without reading more than the first page because my father always said, "It's the same paperwork as last year." I believed him. Now I realized I had spent years signing away my weekends without ever asking myself whether anyone appreciated what I was giving. The next morning, I drafted a short, respectful letter. I thanked the company for the opportunity to serve as its outside financial advisor. I explained that, effective immediately, I would not be renewing my consulting agreement and would remain available only during the standard transition period required by the contract. I read the letter 5 times before signing it. There wasn't a single angry sentence, no accusations, no mention of Vivian or the vacation. Just a professional decision made professionally. My finger hovered over the send button for several seconds before I finally clicked it. I expected relief. Instead, I felt strangely calm, almost peaceful. 10 minutes later, my phone exploded with notifications. Dad called first, then Ethan, then the office manager at the family business. I let every call go to voicemail. A text from Dad appeared almost immediately. "Why did I just receive your resignation? Call me." Another message followed before I could even lock my phone. "If this is about the vacation, you're overreacting." I stared at the screen for a long moment. There it was again. Not an apology, not concern for Lily or Sophie, just another reminder that my feelings were an inconvenience. I placed the phone face down on the table and went outside to help the girls plant flowers in our tiny backyard. Lily proudly held up a packet of sunflower seeds. "These grow really tall, Mom." I smiled. "Then let's give them a good place to grow." As we dug little holes together, I realized how symbolic the moment felt. Flowers don't bloom because you beg them to. They bloom because they're planted in healthy soil. Children aren't any different. That afternoon, I met with several longtime clients who had trusted me with their retirement planning for years. Most of them had known my family business by reputation, but they had always hired me because they trusted my judgment, not because of my father's company. One elderly couple noticed I looked tired. Mrs. Holloway smiled kindly. "Working too hard again?" I almost laughed. Something like that. By the time our meeting ended, I felt more certain than ever that my career had never depended on my family. I had built it one client at a time through honesty and consistency. That realization gave me confidence I hadn't felt in years. Later that evening, Grace called. "Did you send it?" she asked. I did. "How do you feel?" I looked through the kitchen window where Lily and Sophie were coloring together at the table. Like I finally chose my daughters over everyone else's expectations. Grace didn't respond immediately. Then she quietly said, "That's exactly what good mothers do." Around 8 o'clock, another call came from my father. This time I answered. Before I could say hello, he spoke. "What are you doing?" His voice wasn't angry yet, it sounded confused. "Making dinner?" "Don't play games with me, Hannah. Why would you resign without talking to me first?" I took a slow breath. "Did you talk to me before deciding my daughters weren't family?" Silence. Then he sighed heavily. "We're still on that." I closed my eyes. "You say that like it was a misunderstanding." "Vivian didn't mean it the way it sounded." "Then how did she mean it?" He couldn't answer. Instead, he changed the subject. "The timing of this couldn't be worse. The bank has already scheduled next month's annual review." "I'm aware." "Then you know how important your role is." I looked at the girls laughing over a coloring book. Apparently my role is only important when someone needs something from me. He grew quiet. Finally he said, "You're making this personal." I almost laughed. "Dad." It was personal the moment my daughters were told they weren't family. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he asked something that surprised me. "Can we discuss this after we get home?" I answered honestly. I'm not discussing my daughter's worth after your vacation is over. Before he could respond, I ended the call. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty for setting a boundary. The following morning, while Vivian was posting cheerful vacation photos online with captions about making unforgettable family memories, an email quietly arrived in the company's inbox confirming receipt of my resignation and outlining the transition process. It was routine, professional, entirely expected, but I had a feeling someone hundreds of miles away was about to realize that removing one person from the family had consequences they had never bothered to imagine. 3 days passed before the first crack appeared. I wasn't the one who noticed it, it was my father. At exactly 8:17 on Tuesday morning, my phone rang again. I recognized his number immediately, but instead of answering, I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, he called again. Then Ethan. Then the company's office manager. By lunchtime, there were 12 missed calls waiting for me. I wasn't ignoring them to be cruel. I simply wasn't willing to interrupt breakfast with my daughters, client meetings, or bedtime stories anymore just because someone else had failed to prepare for the consequences of their own decisions. After picking Lily and Sophie up from school, we stopped for ice cream before walking through the neighborhood park. They laughed while chasing pigeons across the grass, and for the first time since the vacation disaster, I saw genuine happiness return to their faces. Watching them reminded me why I had finally stopped sacrificing my own peace. They deserved a mother who wasn't constantly exhausted trying to earn approval from people who had already decided she wasn't enough. By the time we got home, another voicemail had arrived from my father. His voice sounded different this time. Less frustrated, more anxious. "Hannah, please call me back. The bank has some questions about the transition. I think there may have been a misunderstanding." I listened without reacting. There was no misunderstanding. I had submitted exactly what my contract allowed me to submit. Everything was transparent. Everything was legal. Everything had been handled professionally. Grace had made sure of that. I deleted the voicemail and continued helping the girls with their homework. The following morning, Grace called while I was organizing files at my office. "I thought you'd want to know what's happening," she said. "Only if it's public information." I replied. She laughed softly. "It is now." According to one of her colleagues who regularly represented commercial lenders, the annual financial review had been moved forward. That wasn't unusual whenever an outside advisor stepped down from a long-term consulting role. Financial institutions routinely reviewed updated documentation when key professional relationships changed. It wasn't punishment, it was standard risk management. "So what happens now?" I asked. "The company provides updated projections, revised governance information, and answers whatever questions the bank asks," Grace explained. "If everything looks solid, business continues, and if it doesn't, then they need time to address the concerns." I thanked her and hung up. There was something strangely comforting about knowing the situation was unfolding exactly as contracts were designed to work. No secret revenge, no dramatic sabotage. Just ordinary business procedures that everyone else had ignored because they assumed I would always be there. That afternoon, my father finally reached me. I answered because I knew avoiding him forever wasn't realistic. "Hannah?" He began immediately. "Why didn't you tell me this would happen?" "Tell you what?" "The review. The extra paperwork, the lenders asking questions." I leaned back in my chair. "Dad, they review documents every year, not like this. This year is different because your outside advisor resigned." Silence filled the line. Finally, he asked quietly, "Were you really that important?" The question caught me off guard. Not because it sounded arrogant, but because it sounded genuinely confused. He truly hadn't known. I closed my eyes for a moment. "Wasn't important because I wanted power," I said calmly. "I was important because I kept showing up." He didn't answer. After another long pause, he admitted, "I don't think I ever realized how much you were doing." Those words should have felt satisfying. Instead, they made me sad. How many years had passed before he finally noticed? How many birthdays had I left early? How many weekends had Lily and Sophie spent waiting for me to finish helping Grandpa with another financial emergency? My father spoke again. "Vivian still thinks you're making this personal." I almost smiled. "Dad, she made it personal the moment she looked at two little girls and decided they weren't family." He sighed heavily. "Things have gotten complicated." "Complicated how?" He hesitated. The succession plan for Ethan may have to be delayed until the review is complete. There it was. For the first time, the consequences had reached the person Vivian had spent years protecting, Ethan. I felt no happiness hearing it, only clarity. Actions had consequences. That evening, while my father wrestled with bank documents, Ethan uploaded another photo from the resort to social media. He stood beside Vivian with a fishing pole over his shoulder, smiling confidently beneath the caption, "Best family vacation ever." Hundreds of people liked the picture. Most of them had no idea what had happened behind the scenes. I looked at the image for a few seconds before quietly closing the app. I no longer needed strangers to know my side of the story. The truth didn't become less true simply because someone else posted happier pictures. The next morning, an unexpected visitor walked into my office. It wasn't my father. It wasn't Vivian. It was Daniel Morris, the chief financial officer of the family business. He had worked beside my father for nearly 20 years, and unlike the rest of the family, he had always treated me with genuine respect. He looked exhausted. "Do you have a few minutes?" he asked. I nodded toward the conference room. Once we sat down, he took a deep breath. "I'm not here to convince you to come back." That surprised me. "Then why are you here?" "Because I think you deserve to know the truth." He placed a thick folder on the table. "Your father never told the board how much of the long-term financial strategy came from you." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel opened the folder. Inside were meeting minutes stretching back years. Again and again, I found recommendations I had made during late-night phone calls or unpaid weekend meetings. Each one had been presented to the board simply as management recommendations. My name appeared only occasionally, despite the fact that many of the ideas had originated from my work. Daniel looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I argued more than once that you should receive formal recognition." "What happened?" He sighed. "Your father always said you didn't care about titles." I stared at the pages without speaking. He wasn't entirely wrong. I hadn't cared about titles. I had cared about family. But somewhere along the way, my willingness to work quietly had allowed everyone else to forget who had actually been carrying part of the weight. Daniel closed the folder gently. "They're starting to understand now." I looked up. "Who is?" He met my eyes. "All of them." For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized the trap hadn't been built by me. It had been built slowly over years of assumptions, silence, and gratitude that no one ever bothered to express. All I had done was step out of it. 2 days after Daniel left my office, I received a message from my father that was unlike any he had ever sent before. There was no request, no excuse, no attempt to minimize what had happened. Just one sentence. "Can we meet somewhere away from the house?" I stared at the screen for several minutes before answering. Not because I was unsure, but because I needed to be certain I wasn't agreeing out of guilt. Finally, I replied with the name of a small coffee shop halfway between our homes. Public, quiet, neutral. The following afternoon, I arrived a few minutes early. My father was already sitting alone near the window. For a moment, he looked older than I remembered. His shoulders seemed heavier, and the confidence he had carried his entire life had been replaced by something closer to regret. As I walked toward the table, he stood up instinctively before sitting back down. Neither of us knew how to begin. After the waitress poured coffee, silence settled between us. Finally, Dad spoke. "I owe you an apology. I waited. Not because of the bank." He lowered his eyes. "Because of Lily and Sophie." Hearing their names instead of vague references to the girls caught me off guard. "I've spent the last week reading documents I should have read years ago." He continued quietly. "Daniel showed me everything." I didn't interrupt. "I knew you helped the business," he admitted. "I didn't know how much of our stability came from your work. I didn't know how many weekends you gave up. I didn't know how many opportunities you turned down because you were helping me." I looked at the coffee in front of me instead of his face. "You never asked." He nodded slowly. "You're right." We sat in silence again before he asked the question I had expected ever since this began. "Can you come back?" There it was. I had wondered whether this meeting was about repairing our relationship or repairing the company. Now I had my answer. I looked at him calmly. "Do you want your daughter back, or do you want your advisor back?" His face fell immediately. He didn't answer because he couldn't. The truth was written all over his expression. He wanted both. But he had only begun missing one after the other walked away. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. "Neither do I." I answered honestly. Some things can't be fixed by pretending they never happened. Dad rubbed his forehead, exactly as he had the night Vivian excluded my daughters, but this time there was no one else in the room to hide behind. Vivian says she never meant to hurt the girls. I looked at him for several long seconds. Intent doesn't erase impact. He nodded slowly. I know, does she? That question lingered unanswered between us. Before he could respond, the front door opened. Neither of us had expected anyone else. Vivian walked inside. My heart sank immediately. She spotted us, straightened her jacket, and walked confidently toward the table as though this meeting had always included her. I figured you'd choose somewhere dramatic, she said before sitting down without being invited. My father looked genuinely surprised. Vivian, I asked to meet Hannah alone. She ignored him and turned to me. I think this has gone on long enough. I remained silent. She folded her hands together. You resigned. Fine. You've made your point. I blinked once. My point. No, the family needs to move forward. It was astonishing. Even now she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge what had actually happened. Vivian? I said quietly, do you know why we're here? Because everyone overreacted to one conversation. I almost smiled, not because anything was funny, but because I finally understood there would never be accountability from her. One conversation. I repeated. You told two 5-year-old girls they weren't real family. She sighed impatiently. I never said it to them. I stared at her in disbelief. You said it about them. She waved her hand dismissively. Children misunderstand things? No, I replied calmly. Adults teach them what to understand. My father closed his eyes. Vivian leaned forward. This isn't just about feelings anymore, Hannah. Ethan's transition into the company has been delayed. Employees are worried. The board has questions. Surely you don't want that on your conscience. There it was. Not an apology, not regret. Just another attempt to make me responsible for problems created by her own choices. I looked directly into her eyes. Do you know what's not on my conscience? She frowned. Protecting my daughters. The table fell silent. For years, I continued. I believed if I worked harder, helped more, stayed quieter, eventually you'd accept us. Instead, every sacrifice became another expectation. Vivian crossed her arms. Families make sacrifices. Healthy families appreciate them. She had no answer. My father quietly looked away. After a long silence, he finally spoke. Vivian. She turned toward him. What? He took a deep breath. She isn't wrong. It was the first time I had ever heard him openly disagree with his wife. Vivian stared at him in complete disbelief. You're taking her side now. There aren't sides anymore? He replied softly. There are consequences. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly across the floor. So this is what we're doing. Blaming me for everything. No one answered. She grabbed her purse and walked toward the exit without another word. My father watched her leave before turning back to me. His voice was barely above a whisper. I should have spoken up that night. Tears filled his eyes. The moment she said those words. I should have stopped her. I believed he meant it. But I also knew something equally important. Regret couldn't give my daughters back the feeling of belonging they had lost. Dad, I said gently, Lily asked me if she wasn't part of the family anymore. He covered his face with both hands. I had never seen my father cry before. I don't expect you to forgive me today, he said quietly. Maybe not even this year. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his for just a moment. Forgiveness isn't the hardest part. He looked up. Then what is? I stood slowly, picked up my coat, and answered with more honesty than I had ever spoken in my life, trusting that my daughters will never have to hear those words again. I walked out of the coffee shop, knowing the conversation was over. Behind me, my father remained alone at the table, finally forced to face a truth he had spent years avoiding. For the first time since my mother died, he couldn't blame grief, work, or keeping the peace. He had to face the simple reality that by staying silent, he had allowed someone else to decide which children deserved to feel like family. A month later, the sunflower seeds Lily and Sophie had planted in our backyard had grown taller than either of them. Every afternoon after school, they ran outside to measure them with a ruler, celebrating every new inch as though they had discovered a miracle. Watching those flowers reach toward the sun reminded me that growth doesn't happen overnight. It happens quietly, one day at a time, in the right environment. Looking back, I realized the same thing was happening to us. We weren't simply recovering from what my family had done. We were finally growing somewhere we felt safe. The family vacation ended several days earlier than planned. I only learned that because Ethan posted a single photo of everyone loading suitcases into the sub with the caption, "Heading home earlier than expected." There were no smiling group pictures this time, no comments about unforgettable memories, no perfect family portraits. A week later, Daniel called to let me know the annual financial review had been completed. The company wasn't closing. No one had lost their jobs. There had been no dramatic collapse, exactly as Grace had predicted. But the bank required updated governance procedures, stronger internal oversight, and a revised succession timeline before approving several future lending requests. Ethan's immediate promotion was postponed indefinitely until the company demonstrated a more stable long-term leadership structure. None of those decisions had been made because I wanted revenge. They were ordinary business outcomes following ordinary business reviews. The difference was that my father had spent years assuming those reviews would always be easier because I was quietly standing behind them. Now he had to move forward without expecting me to carry that responsibility. About 2 weeks after our meeting at the coffee shop, Dad asked if he could see Lily and Sophie. I didn't answer immediately. This wasn't a decision I could make based on my own emotions. It had to be based on what was healthiest for my daughters. After thinking about it for several days, I agreed to meet him at the same neighborhood park where I had taken the girls after the vacation was taken away from them. There would be no family house, no Vivian, no Ethan. Just a grandfather and 2 little girls who deserved honesty. When Dad arrived, he looked nervous. He carried no expensive gifts, no toys, no attempts to buy forgiveness. Instead, he held 2 small paper bags from the local bakery. "I remembered their favorite cinnamon rolls," he said quietly. Lily and Sophie looked at me first. When I nodded, they walked over cautiously. Dad knelt until he was eye level with them. His voice shook. "I owe both of you an apology." The girls listened silently. "What happened before the trip was wrong?" He continued. "None of it was your fault. I should have protected you, and I didn't." Sophie studied his face for a moment before asking the question that mattered most. "Do you think we're family?" My father didn't hesitate. "Yes," he answered, tears already filling his eyes. "You always were." Lily looked at him carefully. Children have an incredible ability to recognize sincerity. After several quiet seconds, she stepped forward and hugged him. Sophie joined a moment later. I watched from a short distance, grateful that my daughters still had hearts willing to forgive even after being hurt. But forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetting. Before we left the park, I spoke privately with my father. "Things can't go back to the way they were," I said. He nodded. "I know. The girls won't be around anyone who makes them question whether they belong. I understand. That includes Vivian." He lowered his eyes. "I understand that too." Whether he truly accepted those boundaries would only be proven over time, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to enforce them. Over the next several months, my own business grew in ways I never expected. Without spending evenings solving problems for someone else's company, I had more time for my clients, more energy for new opportunities, and most importantly, more evenings at home with Lily and Sophie. We started our own traditions. Friday pizza nights on the living room floor, Saturday morning bike rides, Sunday pancake breakfasts where the girls got to choose ridiculous toppings that somehow always ended with whipped cream on the ceiling. Those simple moments became worth more to me than every family holiday I had spent trying to impress people who never appreciated us. One afternoon, Lily came home from school carrying a drawing assignment. Instead of 4 stick figures beside a lake, this picture showed our little house surrounded by tall yellow sunflowers. Across the top she had written, "My family." There were only 3 people in the picture. Me, Lily, and Sophie. "Did your teacher ask why Grandpa wasn't there?" I asked gently. She smiled and shook her head. She said families all look different. Sophie proudly pointed at the drawing. "Hod ours is happy." I felt tears fill my eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of heartbreak. They were tears of relief. Relief that my daughters no longer measured their worth by someone else's acceptance. Relief that they had stopped waiting for invitations that might never come. Relief that they finally understood something I had spent years learning myself. Home isn't where people reluctantly allow you to stay. Home is where you never have to earn your place. Every now and then my father still calls. Sometimes we meet for lunch. Sometimes he attends one of the girls' school performances. He has worked hard to rebuild trust, and I genuinely believe he regrets his silence more than any financial difficulty the company experienced. As for Vivian, we haven't spoken since the coffee shop. From what I've heard through relatives, she still believes I overreacted. Maybe she'll never understand that this story was never about a vacation. It was about two little girls who deserved to grow up knowing they were enough exactly as they were. I no longer need her to understand. Peace doesn't come from changing people who refuse to change. It comes from choosing not to let them decide your worth anymore. Today, when I watch Lily and Sophie laughing in our backyard beneath sunflowers taller than both of them, I don't think about everything we lost. I think about everything we finally found. We found boundaries. We found peace. We found the courage to stop chasing acceptance from people who had already closed the door. Most importantly, my daughters will never again have to wonder whether they're real family. Because the people who truly deserve a place in our lives are the ones who never make children question whether they belong. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping toxic relatives happy and protecting the people you love most, I'd love to know. What would you have done? Several months have passed since that conversation in the coffee shop, and life looks very different now. Not because everything became perfect overnight, but because I finally stopped measuring my family's love by how much I was willing to sacrifice. My father has spent every week trying to rebuild the relationship he nearly lost. He never pressures the girls. He never asks for forgiveness. He simply shows up when he says he will, listens when they speak, and slowly earns back the trust he once took for granted. Watching him learn that love is built through consistency, instead of excuses, has been one of the few gifts to come from all of this. Vivian chose a different path. She never apologized to Lily or Sophie. She never admitted that calling them anything less than family was cruel. At first, she insisted everyone else had misunderstood her. But something changed after that. My father stopped allowing her to make decisions about his relationship with us. Family gatherings became smaller. Invitations were no longer planned around keeping Vivian happy. Even Ethan, after months of working beside people who expected him to prove himself instead of relying on family connections, quietly admitted that he had spent too many years believing he deserved opportunities he had never truly earned. The greatest karma wasn't financial. It wasn't public humiliation. It was watching the control Vivian had fought so hard to maintain slowly disappear because people finally saw the consequences of the choices she had made. As for me, my business continues to grow, but success means something different now. My favorite part of every day isn't signing new clients or reaching new milestones. It's hearing Lily and Sophie run through the front door after school, laughing about their day without ever wondering if they belong somewhere. A few weeks ago, their teacher asked each student to draw a picture of their family. This time, Lily handed me the drawing with a proud smile instead of uncertainty. At the top of the page she had written, "Home is where we are loved." Looking at those words, I realized we hadn't lost a family after all. We had simply stopped chasing acceptance from people who never understood what family truly meant. Sometimes karma isn't watching someone lose everything they own. Sometimes it's watching them lose the trust, respect, and relationships they assumed would always be there. Walking away wasn't the hardest thing I've ever done. Staying long after my daughters stopped feeling safe was. If sharing our story helps even one parent choose their children's peace over someone else's approval, then every painful moment was worth it. So now I'd love to ask you something. If someone looked your child in the eyes and made them feel like they didn't belong, would you keep fighting for a seat at that table, or would you build a better one of your own?